Every Voice Speaks unites and empowers the muscular dystrophy community by elevating patient voices and fostering collaboration across conditions like LGMD, FSHD, myotonic, Becker, and Duchenne. Through personal stories, expert interviews, and accessible discussions, the show helps listeners understand drug development and learn how their input can influence trials, policies, and care. By centering lived experience, it strengthens advocacy, advances research, and supports better futures for kids and adults living with muscular dystrophy. Hello, everybody. Today we're asking a question that's becoming hard to ignore on our show. Who is the current drug development system actually built for, and who is it leaving behind? Across muscular dystrophy community, patient advocates are raising the same concerns. While science is advancing at an unprecedented pace, access to that science does not seem to be keeping up, and it's not reaching everyone equally. But at the center of this issue is something even more fundamental: the voice of the patient. Time and time again, those with lived experience are left out of the very conversations that shape their own future. They're not consistently invited into the decision-making spaces. They're not meaningfully included on panels where policies are discussed. Instead, they are too often placed on the sidelines as observers in a system that directly impacts their lives. Advocates like us and this show are pushing back on that model because patients are not bystanders. We are the experts in living with these conditions every day. Without our insight, we risk building a system that looks effective on paper but fails in reality. This episode will explore what happens when patients are excluded from the process and what we think needs to change to move from a system that speaks about patients to one that truly partners with them. Today, we are happily joined by Kat, our co-host, of course, and our guest, a bioethicist, Rafael Escondon. We're hearing it from families, from adults living with disease, and from those who have progressed beyond trial eligibility. And we're going to talk about what a clinical trial is for those of you that may not know in our audience. We have different tiers of patients, and the big takeaway from today's show is this. At the center of our issue is how therapies are developed, tested, and ultimately approved. Clinical trials, by design, narrow who can participate. But what happens when those narrow criteria become the standard for who deserves access? Kat, I want to start with you today. Please talk about a little bit what you think about drug development currently in muscular dystrophy and who's being left out. What do we mean by the standard for who deserves access, and also about this narrowing criteria?
Thanks for bringing this up. And Ralph, I'm so glad you're here as well because having a bioethicist involved in this conversation is really what we need. I think, Pat, what I'm hearing from patients, families, from everyone is this whole conversation about tiers of patients and those who are left out. And, I can go through and just explain the pockets of patients that I see left out in drug development. Um, I see really young children left out. So these are age before age 5 and 6, a lot of times are left out of clinical trials in drug development. We see people who are not progressed enough. They have clearly the genetic mutation, they've been diagnosed, they have symptoms, but they're not symptomatic enough. They're not as progressed, so they're left out. Then we see another pocket of patients, and that's the advanced patient, the more progressed patient. And they're just not allowed to participate in many clinical trials. As soon as they reach a certain age, they're dropped out. They're not included. And this is kind of a pervasive issue that we're seeing everywhere. And when something gets approved, here's the problem. Those patients that have not been included in the clinical trial don't have access to that drug. So that's where the issue becomes even more of an ethical issue, is because we're not allowed to include these patients. So when they go to try to get this treatment, they're being told no. And we're in a position as advocates who are people living with the disease ourselves, where we need to raise the alarm bells because this is a huge problem. And I think we also need to really start talking about what really is the voice of the patient. We use this term voice of the patient all the time. And, ironically, my nonprofit is called the Speak Foundation, and we speak for the voice of the patients, and especially for the patient in the LGMD space. And the who is the voice of the patient? Who is speaking for us? Because I don't see where we are really being given a seat at the table in a lot of different places. And it's very concerning. We've talked about this before, but we'll go to big events, we'll see lots of things, we'll hear people talking about the patient voice, but ironically, I don't see the patients speaking. So I'd like to hear from you, Pat and Rafa, what your thoughts are, and see what your thoughts about these issues are.
Well, before we bring in Rafa here for a second, just so people know if they're not listening from the medical perspective, right? So a clinical trial, it's a research study that involves human volunteers that test new medical approaches. It could be a drug, a device, or a treatment to determine if they're safe and effective. A clinical trial does not mean that you are getting something that is going to work. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to go to market. It's one of the many, many steps in the development of a treatment or a drug, or it could be, like I said, a device that will help diagnose, treat. Um, and what they do is a lot of times they will compare a clinical trial group to something that already exists. Okay. This is part of the safety and it's part of the steps. It's a multi-year process. And one other thing that we can shed light on, and especially in rare disease, a lot of people want to get into clinical trials, not only just to prove safety, because if it's gotten this far in humans, then there's a hintling that it might be something good and effective. But it is not, it's not suddenly like, we're going to be in a clinical trial and we're going to get up and walk around. So, Rafa, let me bring you in a little bit. Can you just tell us a little bit about your background, what you do in the space, and how you have approached first clinical trial setting and that, and then we'll talk about gaps.
Yeah, sure.
And thank you for being
No,
here.
absolutely. Pat and Kat, my pleasure to be included on your podcast. I think you're asking really important fundamental questions. So let me tell you about my background really quickly. So I was trained originally as a cardiovascular physiologist. I did a clinical postdoc in adult heart failure, so not a rare condition, but that first got me into drug development. I was working on a clinical trial. Then I walked over to the industry side and was involved in clinical trial design and execution for a couple of decades. Along the way, I saw some things, not necessarily unethical things, but things that really sort of, you know, kind of tweaked my curiosity about bioethics and where the nexus of bioethics and research design came in. Then I started working in rare conditions, and that really, really put a focus on that nexus between ethics and getting a program and science, getting a program through, for example, a regulatory agency. So backing up, Kat, to your comment, and then Pat to yours, I think it's really, really important to start on this foundation of what is a clinical trial. A clinical trial, it's an experiment. It is just straight up research, and that is a sort of a hard line that exists, and a hard category with a box around it that's different from the word treatment. A treatment implies that some study has been done, that some objective evidence exists that this intervention actually works. It does what it says. It does what's hoped, and it's got an appropriate sort of safety um, set of criteria around it, that it's safe enough to use, and also has a benefit that can be measured. But a clinical trial itself, for an intervention that has not yet cleared the hurdle of FDA or regulatory approval, it is just that. It's an experiment. No guarantee it's going to work. No guarantee that it's
Right.
not going to hurt you as well. So those are two sort of things that participants need to consider when they are when they're approached about participating in a clinical trial, whether they ultimately qualify for inclusion in that trial or not. So I think that's a very important baseline assumption, is that a clinical trial is an experiment. There's really a question about whether it will work, and whether it will be safe, and whether it will work enough and be safe enough. So that's what clinical trials are all about. Now, both of you said something really important, which is, in a context where it's a rare condition and there may be no approved intervention, no treatment, if you will, right? Treatment is
Yeah.
meant to improve the patient's condition. If there's nothing out there that works, then it's very common for patients themselves, or parents, if the target indication is children, to get very excited about research and really focus a bit too much about the possibility of that intervention actually working, right? Actually being effective.
Yep.
And that can
Yep.
create an
It's true.
imbalance of expectation of benefit, but also sort of diminution or underestimation of possible harm. And those are really things that that companies who are developing these potential new interventions, and investigators, the doctors that actually are responsible for conducting the protocol, and then of course parents or patients themselves, participants themselves, really need to have a good grip on understanding, sort of setting expectations, really understanding that they're part of an experiment, of which the outcome is unknown. So that's that's the milieu that we're talking about. That's really complicated. Then, to take it a step further, and Kat, what you said, and Pat, what you both said, is like, where is the participant voice in this? How could someone, some company, or some set of doctors presume to design a study if they really don't know what their lived experience is like, or if they haven't lived it themselves, right? How could you possibly um, design a series of tests, design this experiment, as I said, without appreciation for what's doable and what's not, right? And that is where there's a big gap. And I think the way that companies have gotten better and better, by no means is everyone perfect at this point, is to really start including either parents or adult participants themselves in the study design, in the protocol design process. And that's not unreasonable to ask for that. And if you want to be the strongest advocates that you can for the condition, my suggestion is to demand that. And I think most companies will listen. On the flip side, however, the companies, their answer to that, to making trade-offs with patients themselves or parents of children that have the condition, is that, you both alluded to this, is that they've got to be able to design an experiment that measures something that can show improvement, that can change in the positive, or that if the nature of the condition is a decline in function or a decline in something over time, that it either slows that or stops it, or just puts you on a plateau forever. And that can take, the latter in particular can take a long time, and you need a lot of participants and a lot of individuals. And if, as a participant yourself, you might not feel that you're improving, because you're actually not, but the diminution in function that may be characteristic of the condition, it's just either leveled off or really slowed down. But that can take a lot of patience and a lot of time to really tease out statistically, which I think makes some of these clinical trials seem quite restrictive in terms of who qualifies. Because someone might not, what I just described, right? If someone's way down here, like right at the bottom of my screen in terms of in terms of the function that's left. If that's the characteristic of the condition, preserving that very low level of function might be really hard to demonstrate mathematically. I'm not
Right.
endorsing that. I'm just saying that that's a reality. That's how companies and statisticians construct the design of an experiment. Whereas someone who's high functioning up here, you might really be able to measure a change or arresting the decline in a shorter period of time. So that's where
Mhm.
clinical trials get pretty, I would say, what's the best word? I think they get fairly dispassionate to those who have the condition, and they put very strict criteria that say, you can't be this far down because I can't show improvement. You can't be this high up because you're actually functioning at a level that is no different than the general population. And as you said, Pat, if you're in this Goldilocks spot, then you qualify. But that brackets out people at the top and the bottom, right?
So that's all great information, Rafa. And I want to just one follow up. Let's just say that, the Goldilocks people qualify and things move forward, and then we're getting closer to trying to either file or we're going to a later phase trials, and it either becomes expanded and more people can try. We also want to talk a little bit about what happens after that, because as Kat said in her intro, we still see a lot of patient population excluded, which I realize makes it extremely difficult for everybody. But at the end of the day, too, our listeners need to understand that, yes, everyone is hopefully coming at this from a wonderful place of trying to help people. But at the end of the day, all of these companies have people to answer to, either venture capital or shareholders. They have to be able to make money. So how do you possibly, in the world of ethics and morals and all the things we've talked about, how do you square that with an argument of access to expanded, like how do you even begin to tackle that? I think what our listeners will want to know too is it gets difficult all by itself, right? So even when it moves past phase 1, 2, and it's going into 3, and it's maybe going to be someday on the market, how do you square that, and how do you collect meaningful data from across cohorts of different patients?
I mean, you raise such an important point, and I think it's something that makes this pursuit so different than really anything else we do in life, right? Where a company has to evaluate their own financial health against the health of individual human beings, right? Or a big group of humans.
Yeah.
It's really hard stuff. And I can't even tell you the number of hours or months or years that I've talked with folks that have more of a financial focus on the business part of biopharma development. And I think for the most part, people are sympathetic, but that's why we need ethicists to remind, and we need strong advocates like yourselves to remind everyone that this is not making widgets. This is not making TVs, computers, tires. These are human participants with lives and health and happiness in the balance, and that, for better for worse, is actually a really good motivator. However, it is true that these things are not free, right? It's very costly to do clinical trials themselves, even one that's super inclusive. It can be very costly in both dollars and time. And that's just a reality. The second thing is that companies also want to try to mitigate their risk. So, for example, imagine a situation, and imagine an intervention that's in development that, while on the one hand might help a narrow category of patients, like we were talking about, but for patients outside that narrow category, actually may have like greater harms, more side effects. And so companies are very gun shy for understandable reasons, but I think they could up their risk tolerance, to be honest, um, for accumulating some of the side effects, either in populations that are outside their Goldilocks population. So companies, I think, are getting better and better. I think advocates can get better and better about saying, hold on, we understand the Goldilocks population. That's the most responsive, and that's who you're most likely to see the change in. And that's what you want to, those are the data that you want to take to the regulatory agency. We get that. But there's all of us out here, and it's not going to harm, we don't think it's going to harm us that you just allow us either expanded access, access outside of a clinical trial, but we believe that this seems to be working. And in order to be eligible for that, there has to have been at least some early stage, usually definitely phase 1, usually early phase 2 stage data that show that the intervention itself is showing some prospect of benefit. That's the time to ask, and that's the time to say, there's more of us out here. Number one, keep those who have benefited on it, keep it available. And by the way, why don't you consider expanding it to those outside the Goldilocks population? It's really not going to hurt.
Are there solutions that we have that we could present that would work? And I guess that's more of a, are there different frameworks? What are some of the solutions that have been mentioned out there?
Yeah, I think the main concern, I'll back up and say, the main concern that a company would push back based on would be not necessarily opening up an open label extension or allowing expanded access to those patients who, like what we're calling the Goldilocks patients, so the patients who didn't qualify in the Goldilocks box, but who have some prospect of benefit, right? You still don't know 100%, even if a phase 2 trial shows positivity. Plenty of interventions fail in phase 3 when they get to a little broader population. So it's no guarantee, it's not a slam dunk or a layup that a program will make it. But in the context of A, nothing else, B, what appears to be success in early and mid stage development, it's not unreasonable to ask. So my first response to your question is ask, and a reasonable company will really think it through. However, what adult patients, potential participants, and parents of pediatric patients really need to consider is that as one of my former coworkers used to say, is the juice worth the squeeze? In other words, is the level of benefit worth the trade-off for potential side effects? Because almost every intervention has some side effects. So it's what we call in ethics a risk benefit. Is the level of benefit, is the prospect and the magnitude of that benefit worth maybe the reality and the magnitude of some side effects? And this is what companies really start to, vibrate about, and for good reason, right? They don't want anything, they don't want to harm anybody. Physicians themselves, the clinical investigators themselves, tend to be the ones that make the decisions about who they'll approach for expanded access, versus versus the company themselves. Sometimes the company allows things to be pretty open-ended, but it might be the investigator's medical judgment that says, "Ooh, there's this additional problem, and this additional problem that make me feel like this is not the best option for you, and let's talk." But they owe you a conversation to talk that through. So again, it's one of those things where I think there's a lot of we call it therapeutic misconception in bioethics, and it is just this higher expectation just by virtue of something being in a clinical trial, having done animal studies that look promising, and having had the FDA say, yes, you can study this in humans. having a sort of disproportionately higher expectation that outweighs the evidence of benefit, and a lower expectation of harm. And so these are
Mhm.
the forces that are in balance. But I say all that, and I say ask, ask for yourselves, advocate, really have companies think about, and have them understand that there's more than just the Goldilocks cohort, right? In the condition.
Mhm.
So let me ask you a loaded question. When do you think, and I'm going back to clinical trials, because they talk about oftentimes measuring endpoints. They have to measure endpoints. And a lot of times in our world of muscular dystrophy, it's how long and far and fast someone can walk. It's climbing, getting up and down from the floor, the stairs. For populations of older people, it may change something like grip strength. It may be something harder to measure, that's not as tactile, right? So do you think, here's the loaded part, do you think harder to measure, or as you say, more risk, sometimes translates into companies saying it might not be worth exploring this because of reasons you just mentioned?
I think that's a reality. Short answer. I think, unfortunately, if positive change can't be shown or benefit can't be demonstrated in some way or another, and you've heard this before, Pat, I know in our
Yep.
conversations,
Yep.
FDA or the big regulatory agencies like the EMA and the Japanese regulatory agency, there's this feels, functions, or survives. And in muscular dystrophy, it's very much a functions. Those endpoints tend to be related to function. So whether it's in Duchenne, the North Star, or the 6 minute walk, or whatever it happens to be, if there's not a validated measurement of function, then it gets a little dicey, and things can get a little noisy, and then you need more patients, of which it's already a rare condition. It can be really hard when there's a bunch of noise around a measurement that you're either trying to stabilize or even maybe improve or stop the decline of. And so these are the challenges that the companies focus on in terms of facing for that Goldilocks set of patients. But again, I think you can make a case that says, that's evidence based, that says, hey, you know what? This program's far enough along. Maybe it's finished phase 2, and they've really defined that Goldilocks population, and they've really defined the level of harm that comes with the benefit that you observe in that Goldilocks population. That lets folks that are outside the Goldilocks population say, I see the downsides. The upsides may not be that great for me, but they might be a little bit. They might be meaningful. And who's the best person to judge what meaningful is? You and me as individuals, right? So I think that's
Sure.
when you can really make a case to say, I know I'm outside this. Don't put me in the registrational trial, but make access available to those who don't fit those inclusion exclusion criteria. Because with gene therapy, it's a little bit different. You have a situation where those are what are called precision interventions. So you've got to have a certain mutation in order to benefit from this particular intervention. And if
Right.
you have, there's also another downside, which Pat Furlong has talked about quite often. We've talked with her over the years about this, where some of these gene therapies require a virus to deliver the actual replacement gene. And if you've been exposed to that virus before, you have antibodies against it. So you're automatically, even if you could benefit, you're automatically off the table, because your immune system will attack the delivery virus, and you won't get the benefit of the gene replacement. So there are certain times when categorically folks that potentially could benefit are going to be excluded, but the hope is to really minimize that.
Well, and I think I was just going to say it's important for us to let everybody know that we're certainly not here to place blame on any one part of the chain or any one company or anything like that. We're trying to educate people as well as to how this is so difficult, why this is so difficult. When a
Mhm.
lot of people throw up their arms and just say, "I don't understand. It seems like it might be working. Why can't I just take this?" Right?
Well,
And again, the answer is safety first. Right? This is great unless somebody loses their life, then it's not so great.
in my viewpoint for the LGMD space, because I can speak to that area that I know really well, and Pat is kind of like, this person that knows like everything Pat mentioned. You were like
You're
the
too kind.
DMT. Well, you're like the DMT guru, the Becker guru, and the LGMD guru. But my thought is wh- what I think should occur is patient advocates should really raise the bar and say to the industries that are coming into our space, like all of the companies that are coming in. And I think if we were to team up as a patient community, not just with LGMD, but with all of the muscular dystrophies in the neuromuscular space, and we say to companies, look, our expectation is that you will do this and allow this in our communities. And we, as a collective group of patient advocates across the spectrums of all muscular dystrophies, are asking for this ethical standard that you will do this. Now, Rafa, I know you're probably saying that's not going to happen. They're not going to do this. But I would say, like, in our patient communities, where have we actually done this? Like, where have we actually discuss these issues across all of the spectrums of muscular dystrophy? I don't think this has happened. I think we've talked about this in small pockets, but I think we need to have more global patient discussions in this whole area because I just don't think we're discussing this in public enough. I think this is like a lot of conversations are kind of in the back rooms and um, they're not public discourse. And that's where I want to start bringing these issues in drug development. I want us to start having public discourses right here on our podcast, not in a, you know, I'm going to shame a company because that's truly not my feeling at all. It's more of a let's discuss what the issues are and why companies are struggling to do it. Because, Rafa, to your point, you're talking about this issue that I think is really big and that these companies are worried that it's going to affect their clinical trials if they allow it. And yes, I know the FDA has said that, but sometimes the FDA has not always been the most consistent in how they apply things. So there's the verbal thing that you hear from the FDA, but then there's the actual thing that you see the FDA actually doing. But I feel like if we talked more about this in a discourse, because I think that we need to discuss the various issues. Also, I'd like to see some research done on how many times the FDA has creating an issue when there's been a negative outcome in expanded access. I'm sure there has been because patients that apply for expanded access are probably very, very sick. And there's probably been some negative things that have happened. And let's do some research and see what are the percentages. Has it really ever affected the clinical trials? And I think if we could start showing that it really doesn't, and this is more of a hypothetical fear and worry, I think we would get somewhere in terms of drug developers being more willing to accept expanded access. That's just some of my thoughts here in patient advocacy. But Pat and Rolf, I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are on some of the stuff I just said.
My idea is like, well, let's hold hands a little bit and play some kumbaya here and just say, look, the stakeholders here, the patient groups are the same. And so ethically, let's really, really try and share a little bit more. And there's been incremental change in that. If there are a couple of examples in the Duchenne community over the past 7 years or so, where companies in the gene therapy space got together a little bit and said, we're seeing this safety concern over here. And are you guys? And are you guys? And are you guys? And we all have skin in this game. So let's find a way to trust each other enough to share this information because it's relevant to the whole community of patients, obviously, but also to those who have an interest in developing a treatment. So, all that to say is yes, it would be great if complete response letters were issued were shared in a timely fashion, had less redactions, had more information that could be shared with all stakeholders. But it's even more than that. I feel like it's milestones along the way where uh, competing programs would share more with each other and advocates and investigators, as well as if the FDA could have, I think, a little more comfort and freedom to say, hold on, we've got relevant information over here with program X that
Mhm.
very much relates to program Y or Z or P or D or Q, not to mention to all the patients. So big call
Mhm.
for sort of a from an ethical perspective, a relaxation or at least an acknowledgement that we really do have an obligation to share more information. It would probably speed up all programs, and by speeding up programs, it might actually even bring development costs down. That's a little pie in the sky. That's a little Pollyannish, but I've been
Yeah.
calling for that for a long time.
No, Rafa, I am 100% with you. It's one of those things that I'm, calling for in our LGMD space is because I see from the umbrella perspective of being an organization that works like across all of the drug development landscape in our area. I see the exact same thing, and also remember to think through this is scientific research. Ultimately, that's what we're doing.
Mm.
And we're learning. And when we're siloing this information in these scientific experiments, which is really what they are, that we are basically saying, okay, we're going to silo this understanding that we have just gleaned from this experiment. And honestly, if we were to share the knowledge here and we were to give it over there into this other trial that's ongoing, where we could provide more safe and effective treatments because we would inform one another on the research we're understanding. But I don't see that that always happens. But right now, I see this in gene therapy that we all know sirolimus is a much safer thing and it protects the liver in gene therapy. So we've learned this over the last, 6 months. It's something that's kind of a well-known thing for researchers to understand that sirolimus is safer. And by the way, people mispronounce that word all the time. So it's not sirolimus, it's sirolimus. I just wanted to make sure everybody know that's how you pronounce it. But I feel like this is the issue right now in gene therapy is that we could see safer treatments if we were just discussing this more in a broader scenario across all of the gene therapies in the neuromuscular space. But I don't see that really occurring. And it's an unusual thing to me because, back to your point, this is scientific research and we should be looking at this from a different perspective than just individual clinical trials. I think ultimately, what's the point if we're not going to further the whole field scientifically?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I think in gene therapy, just to digress to that example, one of the areas where it would have been really nice to share information a little bit earlier, but again, the information had to accrue was in the scenario of yeah, what to use for immunosuppression, right? Like many companies were doing that very differently, and so whether you used steroids or you used mTOR inhibitors, which I won't pronounce the name of the one you just described, or others like Rituxan, or like companies were sort of all over the map on what they were using. And if there was one, as you point out, that was safer, that we needed to accrue more more research data on, that I don't think there was a lot of confidence that that was happening as quickly as it could, and that those data were being shared across all the relevant stakeholders as quickly as it could be. And so there's a perfect example of why there's really an ethical sort of, you know, an ethical force to be reckoned with there, to say we need to share this information because it's good for everybody, right? So I think we learn as we go. That's what research is. And so you also just pointed out again that really important difference or threshold or hazy area between scientific research and treatment. And, so a clinical protocol that's very structured and expanded access, which is something that's different. So these are the importance. I've been moaning for nomenclature, real adherence to nomenclature for a long time. I think maybe the toothpaste is out of the tube or the genie's out of that bottle, but I'll never stop trying.
I want to say thank you, Rafa, for all of this, and Pat as well. In this podcast today, for anybody that's listening, we are discussing a lot of different topics. We're really discussing the bioethics of patients receiving treatments that are in clinical trials. We're also discussing about how patients want to receive treatments and the ethics around surrounding receiving potential treatments. And all of these issues are very emotionally charged.
Mm.
However, we're not really having these conversations the way we're having them today openly. And so, this podcast, we're trying to discuss things and have public discourse on these very important topics. So we hope you enjoyed listening today, and I'm sure you have thoughts and comments. If you do, please send them to Pat at his email.
It's fine. I love it. And Rafa, thank you so much. Do you have give us a little parting wisdom, Rafa, of what we as the patient advocate community can and should be focusing on to help advance the mission and get stuff to market that will hopefully benefit all of us.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I'm glad you asked. And I agree, Kat. Thank you for those comments. The thing that I think is most important is to recognize that things continue to move very quickly, and that's a good thing. I think new potential interventions for rare conditions emerge all the time, and I think we've been seeing um, the past decade or so, it has been very positive in terms of that. On the flip side, though, I think it's really important to acknowledge that there was a previous way of doing things in air quotes drug development. And so be as hard as it is for me to say be patient, it's going to take a while for that to change, but continue to absolutely rattle everyone's cage with the lived experience and the patient voice. It will continue to reap benefits, and try to be open-minded about the position of the regulator and the position of industry and the position of all stakeholders. As hard as that is to do, there's a lot of precedent there that needs to get shattered. So let's do that.
Yeah, I love that precedent that needs to get shattered. And remember that we're trying to all work from the same side of the lab bench and help patients. Rafa, thank you so much. And thanks, Kat.
Thanks, Pat.